Imagine standing on a Siberian ridge with your hiking group, and within seconds, your strongest friend begins screaming as a dark fluid seeps from his eyes and ears. Then, one by one, the others start tearing at their clothes in -20 degrees Celsius wind, as if something invisible is dismantling them from the inside out. This happened in 1993. 7 went up. Only one, a 17-year-old girl named Valentina, returned to tell the story. But to understand how she survived, you have to understand the place that broke the others. Because on the bold, gray spine of the Khamar-Daban Ridge, deep in the heart of the Siberian wilderness, the air here doesn't just move around you. It pushes. It's a constant, rhythmic pressure that vibrates against your teeth and hums deep inside your chest. You try to swallow, but your jaw is locked tight, and you realize your own body is reacting to something your eyes can't see yet. It's a low, vibrating dread that tells you the very atmosphere has turned against you. You look for a tree to break the force, or a bush to muffle the roar, but there is nothing. Just a jagged lunar landscape and a sky the color of wet slate. You feel a sudden, desperate urge to run, a cold knot tightening in your stomach. But there is nowhere to hide. Lyudmila Korovina adjusted the heavy canvas straps of her rucksack. The wool of her coat was damp, smelling of old wood smoke and the sharp, metallic tang of the storm that had been chasing them for 2 days. She was 41 years old, a master hiking instructor who had survived these mountains more times than she could count. She knew the grit of the Siberian mud. She knew how to read the clouds. And she knew her team. Around her were 6 students. They were young, the youngest just 15, the oldest 23. Just 48 hours ago, they had been laughing. They had met Lyudmila's daughter's hiking group on a lower trail, exchanging rations and jokes, their faces bright with the thrill of a Category 3 trek. They felt invincible. They felt strong. But as the morning of August 5th broke, the mountain decided to stop being a playground. A cold cyclone had slammed into the ridge overnight. The rain didn't fall, it arrived horizontally, a freezing sleet that turned the tundra into a slurry of gray mud. Valentina, 17 years old and shivering, watched as her friends tried to pack the camp. Their fingers were clumsy and white. The small camping stove, their only source of heat, refused to light. The fuel was damp, the air too thin, the wind too violent. She felt the heaviness of the wet nylon tents as they struggled to roll them. The silence between them was heavy, filled only by the roar of the wind. They were cold, they were exhausted, but they were still a team. Then, the normalcy of a difficult hike shattered. Alexander, who was 23 and arguably the strongest of the students, suddenly stopped walking. He didn't sit down. He didn't call for a break. He began to scream. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that cut right through the howl of the cyclone. Valentina watched, frozen, as Alexander's hands flew to his ears. He fell to his knees on the slick rock, and then his head snapped back. A dark fluid began to seep from his ears and the corners of his eyes, a terrifying sign that the pressure inside him had reached a breaking point. It didn't look like a typical injury. It looked as though his body was being compromised by the atmosphere itself. He was being unmade by something invisible. Lyudmila didn't hesitate. She was the instructor. In that moment, she was the mother of this entire group. She threw her pack aside, the heavy canvas shifting and hitting the wet ground with a dull thud, and she scrambled through the slurry of mud to reach him. She moved across the slick rock until she could grab his shoulders. She pulled Alexander's head into her lap, anchoring herself to the slope while the wind tried to pull them apart. She was shouting, her voice straining against the roar of the cyclone, telling the others they had to move. She told them to take their things. She told them to get down, to find the tree line, to get to safety. She told them she was staying right there. She would stay with him. But as the students turned to run, as they tried to follow the last order she would ever give them, the sickness caught them. It didn't happen in stages. It didn't give them time to realize they were in danger. It happened with a speed that defied every rule of biology. It happened with a speed that defied logic. Tatiana seemed to lose all connection to reality. She began repeatedly striking the frozen earth and the sharp rocks around her with a rhythmic, senseless force. She wasn't seeking cover or trying to hide. She was reacting to something no one else could perceive, her movements mechanical and unstoppable. Dennis and Victoria didn't run for the trees. They didn't seek the shelter of the forest below. Instead, they stood still in the sub-zero wind chill and began to tear at their own clothes. They weren't just undressing. They were ripping the buttons from their jackets. They threw their gloves into the mud, letting their only protection against the frost settle into the wet grit. They stood in the sub-zero wind, but they weren't trying to stay warm. Instead, they began frantically tugging at their collars and grasping at their own throats, as if something invisible was constricting them. They looked like they were struggling to draw breath from an air that had suddenly turned to lead. Within minutes, the bald, gray slope of Khamar-Daban Ridge was a graveyard, but it was a graveyard of the living. Valentina stood at the edge of the chaos, her lungs burning from the cold air. She saw Lyudmila, the woman who had taught her everything about survival, stop moving. Lyudmila remained seated on the ground, her arms still curved in a cradling position, her hands held as if she were still protecting Alexander. But Alexander wasn't there. His body had lost its grip on the mud and had rolled significantly further down the mountain. Lyudmila was cradling the empty space where he had been. She was protecting a ghost. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, unblinking, as the sleet began to crust over her skin. Valentina turned and ran. She didn't look back at the shapes on the slope, the people who, only hours ago, had been her friends. She didn't look back at the instructors she had idolized. She simply ran until the jagged, gray rock of the mountain ridge gave way. She ran until she reached the tree line, entering the dark, oppressive green of the Siberian forest. The forest was worse. In the mountains, the wind had been a roar. It was a constant, deafening wall of sound that filled every space. But here, in the trees, there was a silence. It was a silence so profound that it felt physical. It felt like a weight. Valentina didn't hear the sound of birds. She didn't hear the rustle of small animals moving through the undergrowth. There was no movement in the needles on the forest floor. She heard only one thing: the sound of her own frantic breathing hitting the freezing air. Breath after breath. Cold, sharp. She spent 4 days in that silence. 4 days where the only constant was the absence of everything she had known. She finally crawled into her sleeping bag. The material was cold against her skin. She was shivering, shivering so hard that the sound of her teeth clicking was the only noise in the trees. In her fist, she clutched a single, sharp metal tent peg. She held it tight. She stared into the darkness of the Siberian pines. She watched the shadows between the trunks, waiting. She was waiting for whatever had just happened on that slope, whatever had just killed her team, to come for her. She was 17 years old. She was covered in the mud of a mountain that had just eaten 6 lives, and she was entirely alone. 4 days later, a group of kayakers was moving down a nearby river. They were enjoying the tail end of their trip, the sun finally breaking through the clouds, when they saw a figure on the bank. It looked like a statue made of rust. Valentina was standing perfectly still, her clothes stiff and weathered by the tragedy she had just escaped. She didn't look like a 17-year-old girl anymore. She looked like someone who had seen the world end and had nowhere left to go. When the investigators finally reached the ridge on Khamar-Daban, they arrived with certain expectations. They expected to find the remnants of a disaster they could categorize, a disaster they could understand. They looked for the aftermath of a landslide. They looked for the telltale signs of a lightning strike. They looked for the remains of a bear attack. What they found was a scene that felt staged. The bodies were scattered across the slope, frozen. They were found in the exact positions Valentina had described. There were no bullet wounds. There were no tooth marks from predators. There were no signs of a struggle with any outside force. Just the quiet, gray rock and the bodies. The medical exams produced the most haunting detail of all. Inside their bodies, the doctors found catastrophic internal trauma. It was as if their bodies had absorbed the full force of a high-pressure shockwave. Every internal system had suffered severe damage. Yet on the outside, there wasn't a single scratch. They were broken from the inside out, while their exteriors remained perfectly intact. But there was no blast. There was no scorched earth, no craters, no shrapnel. Their skin was perfectly intact. Their bones were not broken. Their clothes, though torn by their own hands, showed no signs of heat, no signs of fire. It was as if an invisible hammer had struck their internal organs, a strike that shattered the soft tissue inside while leaving their exteriors untouched. And then there was Valentina. Valentina had been standing in the same mud, the same square of ground. She had breathed the same freezing air. She had eaten from the same supply of dehydrated rations. But she hadn't bled from her eyes. Her lungs were clear. Her heart was beating perfectly. The world has tried to fill the silence of the Khamar-Daban tragedy with theories. Some people talk about infrasound, a phenomenon where the wind hitting the unique shape of the mountain peaks creates a low-frequency sound wave that the human ear can't hear, but the human body can feel. It's a sound that can vibrate internal organs until they rupture. It's a sound that causes a primal, uncontrollable panic in the brain, forcing people to tear off their clothes or bash their heads against rocks just to make the vibration stop. Others talk about secret Soviet chemical tests. They whisper about nerve gas or toxic algae blooms from Lake Baikal that drifted up the slopes like a phantom. But no theory explains why the mountain chose 6 people and spared the 7th. Valentina Utochenko survived, but she carried that ridge home with her. In the years after, she spoke only briefly about what happened. The official conclusion pointed to hypothermia and panic. But the details never fit neatly. The sudden collapse, the strange behavior, the internal damage with almost no visible injuries. So what do you think happened on Khamar-Daban? One theory? Or something no one has named yet? Share your take in the comments and subscribe for more real cases like this. See you in the next mystery.